Hey YouTube, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another Historian Reacts video. Alright, it's been a while since we did some alternate history, so I put up some topics up into this past week's Patrons Pick poll, and this is what won. And it is, what if Germany had been split differently after World War II? That's a great question to ask because, you know, the whole splitting of things becomes a key part of Cold War competition right after World War II. So I'm interested to see what Alternate History Hub has to say about this, and I'll make sure to let you know what I think about it too. All right, the original video link is down below. Make sure you're supporting Alternate History Hub. They're kind of the pinnacle of alternate history type videos, and they do a great job of it. So definitely give it a view, like, subscribe, and if you like what's going on here, love to have you as a sub as well. All right, let's go ahead and get to it.
After 2 world wars, everyone was done with Germany.
Yeah.
And even as...
Pretty much. Wait, does Germany have a YouTube play button on it? Because you can't put the you-know-what logo. You know, you can get trouble for that on YouTube.
Was done with Germany. And even as World War II was ongoing, there were plans of what to do with Germany once the fighting had ended. Right. Now, as we know, Germany was divided between the 4 victors, and the tensions of the Cold War eventually split it into 2 states. It makes sense why Germany was split in the way that it was, considering the Soviets held that territory. And so we never...
Yeah, I mean, the Western Allies did not trust a Soviet-run Europe afterwards. They'd already taken over a ton of territory on the way to, Germany. And the Western Allies didn't trust Stalin, even though Stalin said that, those countries would be able to hold free elections and all this stuff. That stuff, of course, doesn't happen. That's another story in itself, though. But, yeah, they also didn't want Germany just to be left on their own, like basically what happens in World War I. It's like, they are going to oversee the rebuilding of Germany, because they don't want another thing like what happened in World War I, which is like conquer it, slap on the bill to Germany, and then kind of trust them to rebuild in a way that the rest of the world would like, because of course that didn't happen.
Never really think of it going different. How else could anyone have imagined it being divided? Turns out a few had their own ideas on how to split the Germans, each making their own lines on a map about what a post-war Germany should look like. There were multiple plans, so I and another alternate history channel, What If Alt Hist, decided to pick a different plan.
I don't know that
Each of
channel.
us would pick one plan and then theorize how that specific map would turn out in history.
Okay.
FDR had a plan to just entirely dissolve Germany, reorganizing it into smaller states. Not quite as small as in the Holy Roman Empire, but
that's impossible.
What If Alt Hist theorizes about how such a plan might pan out in his own video, so go check that out. There was also a plan by good old Churchill to split Germany north to south, with the South being a horrific abomination. Oh god. Yes, Churchill drank a bit too much and felt sentimental about the days gone by.
Yeah, we don't need an Austria-Hungary again, which is exactly what's happening.
Austria-Hungary still existed. Yet there was one plan that, even though it hadn't been implemented, it did have real-world consequences, and it was considered a plan from the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, of all people, Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau wanted to divide Germany alongside the North and South lines as well, but with one major difference. The industrial heartland of Germany in the West, the source of its economic and militaristic strength, would be entirely removed from its borders. A deliberate plan to fundamentally alter German society.
Is that like taking away the Rhineland, which, like after World War I, which was of huge economic importance and was a problem because, the Germans had to pay incredible war reparations, after the war, but then you also take away their ability to pay by taking industrial lands. Of course, they're overseas colonies as well, so that could be a problem. That's one of those things, it seems like if you take that away, that fuels the anti-Allied fire, just like what happened in World War I. Then you truly feel like you are being screwed over and have incentive to retaliate. So I think taking away that chunk does exactly what I just said there.
Only in denazification, but to remove its capability to ever be a modern nation again. What if in an alternate timeline, somehow, this plan was agreed upon?
Oh.
The Morgenthau Plan. It's an alternate
Okay.
1945.
I already told you what I think would happen. It would give incredible incentive to hate the post-war peace process and be something that, again, could look a lot like World War One, which leads to World War Two. All right, let's see where they go with this.
The war is over. Yippee. I would imagine that in this timeline, the plan for what would happen to Germany is entirely unknown to the public. The Morgenthau Plan is not leaked to the press, mostly because, if it still is, it faced the same scrutiny that it did in our timeline. This is a scenario where the Western powers are much harsher to Germany and fully commit to absolute revenge. It was hard to simply let many aspects of
happened
German
in World War
society
I.
continue on after so much destruction had occurred. There was no real urge to follow through with the Morgenthau Plan, for reasons I'm going to get into. And this was stemmed from fears of the plan failing so badly that it would only backfire in the face of the West, undoing all of the gains that they made during the war.
Yeah.
Not only out of a worry that Nazism would resurface,
Sure.
but also that the German public would turn to the Soviets and communism in response. In such a timeline, let's imagine these considerations are just not thought about. Over the course of the next few years, the Americans, British, and French would begin the deconstruction and demolition of any factory or manufacturing plant in the region.
Wait. Okay, I'm sure they'll explain it, but what are they saying happens to this land? That it still belongs to Germany, but they destroy it? Like all the factories? Or it gets taken away completely, and then who does it belong to? Who administrates it?
A region that Germany relied on for not simply wartime production, but production of everyday basic goods. You know, the factories that we need for a modern society. The people who relied on these factories for jobs or production would protest these actions, of course, perhaps leading to riots and open rebellion, only to be brutally taken down by occupation forces. The Allied forces...
I mean, that's the grounds for fascism. I mean, look at what happened after World War One. The insane amount of unemployment that was going on into the lead up of the Nazi Party and their real gain into power was larger in response to the incredible amount of unemployment. Unemployment is one of those things that seeds revolutions and whatever they may come about, whether it's fascism, communism, whatever it is, it provides the seeds for revolution.
Proceed to tell people living in this international zone, and this was the plan, by the way, I'm not making this up, that the German people would never again be allowed to have manufacturing or industry at all. Those that relied on the factories for jobs should move elsewhere instead. In effect, this plan was to remove the capability...
Those countries aren't going to want immigrants. They're not going to want immigrants.
For millions of working men to provide for their families. No factories of any kind would be allowed to exist in what was once the industrial heartland of Germany. And the thing was, this was an action that Morgenthau fully anticipated, as what he essentially planned was bringing an industrial state back into an agricultural society. As for the rest of Germany, it would be split between North and South. The idea was to differentiate between the heavily Catholic South and the Prussian Protestant North. Somehow Prussia still exists in this timeline.
Prussia
so
2.0?
You take some and you leave some. I would imagine this North German state would be smaller than originally planned, just by how much advancement the Soviet troops made. And it's likely it may have been split into even 3 states. And such a confusing mess between the 3 wouldn't really be a concern, as Germany being a functioning state isn't in the question. Germany is no longer meant to be a state. This perpetual occupation was what turned many off of the idea of the Morgenthau Plan in the first place, and Churchill even commented that he didn't want the British tied to what was essentially a dead corpse. As what happens when you remove...
Good way to think about it. Now, in actual reality, the Western Allies building up the infrastructure of Western Germany and their industry was to have a trading partner, right? This was the era of that. And, wanting more and more trade partners, people to buy and sell goods with. And the United States, especially was interested in that. So like demolishing the industrial part of Germany economically would hurt the United States for that fact, because you wouldn't have, again, the products and the international trade relationship that you would have. But in this scenario, it's like they don't care. They don't care. They're more concerned about punishing Germany than like, you know, an economic future. And this became a huge part of the Cold War as it became like capitalism versus, you know, communism, and the wealth being generated out of Western Germany was something that, you know, like the United States and the West propped up as evidence that the capitalistic system is the one that should be favored in the world.
Remove the industry from a society. You remove the ability for anybody to feed themselves or make a living, and you essentially created a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
Yet sticking with the Morgenthau Plan, there is no room for foreign aid to the Germans. The people were now a part of an agrarian state and should use that to their advantage. However, there's an issue. Poor harvests and the lack of production of fertilizer in the post-war years resulted in food frankly not being existent. Germany, even in our own timeline, didn't have the capability to feed its own people. Yet there was no American aid in this alternate world.
Really?
Instead, the plan continues on. So here's the thing.
It'd be open to anybody then. Anybody going to do the aid. And if it's the Soviet Union coming in to do that, obviously the Germans would then side with Soviet policies.
Been estimated that if the Morgenthau Plan continued on as it was planned, an estimated 25 million people would have starved to death. 5 times
assuming
as many
nobody
Germans
comes to their aid.
would die in the Allied occupation than in the war itself. So at this point, it's pretty clear that had the actual Morgenthau Plan gone through, and it was apparent that so many people were going to starve to death, the Allies would have backed off such a harsh plan. They weren't going to just let millions starve to death in the middle of Europe. But let's say that they did anyway. It's not like the Germans could, you know, fight back. First off, imagine how exactly it would appear following the war, when the victorious Allied powers, in this case the Western powers, occupy Germany and simply stand by and watch as millions die under their control. It would be an atrocity even greater than the Holodomor, actually, by many more millions. In fact, it'd mean that the Western powers would have killed just as many innocents as the Nazis in Russia or the Japanese in China. So by doing this, by committing to this, the Western powers in many ways immediately lose their validity after the war.
Yeah.
So the German
I would say that now they become these monsters in the eyes of the rest of the world, as creating a genocide worse than the war itself.
people, they were brainwashed by the Nazi regime and told that if the war was lost, German society would die, along with everyone they knew and loved. Yet, post-war, the German people instead saw the American occupation with planes flying in food when they were hungry, a plan to rebuild their society, and a removal of an ideology that only brought them pain. Now instead, in this alternate timeline, the Americans tear down the factories, internationalize a large chunk of their country, split Germany in two, and then their troops openly parade in the streets and sit by while a quarter of the population openly and slowly starves to death. So, had this plan actually continued, the victorious Allies would have committed equal atrocities to the Nazis, or at least enough atrocities to muddle the waters in the most black and white good versus evil war ever. The end of World War II would not be the end of Nazism or fascism within Germany. In fact, it would only openly solidify Nazi propaganda against the Americans.
I'd agree.
For the Germans, the war would have been seen as one of self-defense against a ruthless cabal that the Nazis were talking about. And now, the Americans were going to kill everyone. God, this video is going to get demonetized so bad. And in fact, the ending of World War II for Germany would very much be like the end of World War I. A nation once again defeated, but the ideology continues on. There is no scenario where it's split in two and then reunited and becomes the undisputed leader of Europe. There is no EU. Any chance that it may, in a way, be integrated into the West, snuffed out after such a failed occupation. And so this is a part of a lesson. The peace after a war is often more important than any battle or conflict,
Yeah.
especially in a war of ideologies. To win a conflict, you can't simply...
And especially in a war where, like, World War I and World War II are seen as these wars where it gets pinned on the narrative of the war that the aggressors are the ones that lost. So it puts the fate of the aggressor, the original aggressor, into the hands of ones that were they felt oppressed or whatever. Right? Happened in World War I, happened in World War II. So there's that animosity that gets added into the peace process where it becomes about revenge rather than if the aggressive state is the one that wins out. You may not necessarily have that. And that's what is happening here.
Outproduce your enemy or beat them on the battlefield. And not only did fascism need to collapse under its own weight, and for its former supporters to see it for the sham that it was, there also needed to be a replacement ideology to step in and fundamentally better the society afterwards.
Berlin airlift.
This was in many ways why the West went with the Marshall Plan instead. Right. By rebuilding Germany and showing them how the Americans and British were not the corrupt monsters
makes you look
Hitler
like the good guy.
Had portrayed them to be. It allowed for the transition into a democratic state to be easier, more homegrown. And one example to show the benefits of democracy was by bringing in truckloads of food to a starving population. Yes, you can argue this was to prevent the Germans from turning to the Soviets, but it was also to deal...
More than anything. Remember, Germany becomes the battleground for the ideological battle of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But it was like a win-win situation in the eyes of the Americans where it's like their whole way of life gets promoted and whatever moral stance they're taking there, but then also to create a valuable economic partner.
Legitimize the fear-mongering the fascists had brainwashed the population with for years. This was a crucial junction point for Germany, and if the worst-case scenario of World War II was the Nazis winning, the second worst-case scenario would be if people thought the Nazis, by accident, were proven correct. And to a terrifying degree, many would be...
But, I mean, that wasn't necessarily the Nazi platform about what these allies are doing there. Their platform was directed towards other issues, but it wouldn't necessarily prove them right, but may gain some support, and maybe the whole Nazi platform ends up expanding.
Begin to think Germany was better off under the Nazis because at least they had food. The democratic institutions put in place are not really supported by the people, and if they are, they're only increasingly right-wing or left. No hearts and minds are one. The German republics are seen simply as puppets, and as what happens with any puppet, once the hand is taken out, it goes limp. While this video is about World War II, this more importantly is a video about institutions and ideologies.
Sure.
Institutions only have credibility if people have faith in them. If the Morgenthau Plan had gone through, it would have given the Germans their first view of democracy, one as a punishment, a distinct negative in their lives.
Well, they already had a distinct view of democracy under the Weimar Republic, right? So, which already, collapsed their faith in it. So it's like democracy fails twice in Germany.
Cause a hatred that only undermines the very governments set up as replacements for the Nazis. If a government is only held up by foreign force, then it's simply a puppet, and it will collapse easily once the occupational force leaves. Every single time. Right. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
All right, let's talk about this, and let me know what you think down below. All right, so yeah, a lot to chew on. I didn't know really about this plan. Morgenthau, is that what they called it? Plan or whatever? Got that. Back 3, 2, 1. All right, a lot to think about with this plan, because I hadn't really heard of that before, but it does seem like a bad idea in about every way that you can spin it. The only thing you would think of it as a good idea was to punish the German public, I guess. And that's about all you get out of it. You get nothing beneficial for anyone really involved there. So yeah, but I think most of the stuff they brought up about how it would lead to, of course, like famine. And again, the idea of the plan is that whole green part, the whole top part, green part of the map that they were talking about was an industrial hub, and then just obliterating that would ruin Germany, right? It would go to this agrarian state. But then even then, if they go to as an agrarian state, they wouldn't be able to survive because they wouldn't be able to produce chemicals, for farming. Infrastructure would be broken, and that would lead to starvation, and then that would also lead to, in some direction or another, probably political ideology shifts, or maybe push towards extremism, whether it's sweeping into kind of the arms of the Soviet Union under their ideologies, or doubling down maybe on Nazism. So I definitely agree that those parts would definitely happen there. So there's a lot of things I think we would agree upon that seem like the pretty obvious things that would happen in the wake of if this plan had in fact happened. But there were a lot of different ways that Germany could have been split. They talked about them earlier, but going with this one of destroying their economy that way definitely seems like all of the things after would be, very much a reality. As always with these alternate history ideas, let me know what you think down below. What do you think about this plan? Is it something that you think could be good in any other way? Am I not thinking about it in the right way, that it could have been beneficial in some way? And what do you think about other plans? Also, do you think that the plan that ends up actually happening, the four-way split and all that, do you think that was a good way to go about things? You can hypothesize, and that's always kind of fun to talk about. And be sure to discuss others and get some good conversations going. All right, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and call it here, and we'll see you next time. Bye.